Welcome to another episode of Mr. Plumb's Thoughts. Today I wanted to talk about the Book of Abraham. This is a text that gets criticized quite a bit by critics of the church. And so I thought it'd be good to do a video on it, talk about it a little bit, and hopefully I can convince you that it is truly a divinely inspired work. So what is the Book of Abraham? Joseph Smith obtained some papyri and some various other artifacts from an Egyptian salesman that was traveling through his area in 1835. He was inspired to purchase some of these things, and then a handful of years later, in 1842, he published what we have now as the Book of Abraham, and with it was 3 facsimiles that are basically Egyptian scenes with hieroglyphics and things like that. Most of the papyri was lost in a fire in 1872, the Great Chicago Fire. There are some people that claim that the papyri was actually moved before the fire. Whatever the case may be, somehow we lost a whole bunch of it. The papyri, the fragments we have left, resurfaced in the 1950s or 60s. I can't remember exactly when. But when it surfaced, it's estimated that we basically only have anywhere from about 13 to 30% of what the original scrolls were. So there's a lot that's missing. And modern critics claim that it's a funerary text and that Joseph Smith was basically wrong in everything that he said about it. So I want to talk a little bit first about the translation process. So a lot of people think, okay, well, he had these scrolls, so he, somehow was inspired to translate them character for character, right? Like a one-for-one translation. But that's not really how he translated it. We're told he translated by the gift and power of God. We aren't really told too many specifics, really. So we are kind of left to draw our own, theories and conclusions here. However, we do have quite a bit about how the Book of Mormon was translated, and it makes sense that it would use the same process. So the Book of Mormon, was on the golden plates that were discovered in a hill in New York by Joseph Smith. And it was not translated directly. Multiple witnesses said that Joseph Smith, there were different ways that he would translate, but the most popular one that people talk about, especially critics, is him throwing stones in the bottom of a hat. And so that is true. He had the Urim and Thummim, and he would throw them into the bottom of a tall top hat, and then he would put his head into that hat and fold the bill around to block out as much ambient light as he could. And then in the darkness of that hat, he would see words that would appear. Some people said that those words would appear on a piece of parchment kind of floating in the air. Others said it was just words that would appear. But most of these accounts, are secondary accounts, and we don't really know. Joseph Smith never told us exactly what he saw in there and how he translated. So we're kind of left, to doing some research on that and, reading testimonies from other people that he talked to about this process. And we do know that for a lot of the translation of the gold plates, the plates themselves were covered or in another room entirely. And Joseph was not, flipping between the leaves of that book and translating. He just left it there. And so, whatever he received with his head tucked in that hat, was clearly the gift and power of God. I like to say there was probably an angel on the other side of the veil that was conveying the story to Joseph Smith. But we really don't know exactly how that worked. We can theorize all day, but in the absence of additional evidence, that's really all that can be our theories. But this is the same way that the Book of Abraham was translated. It wasn't translated directly from the papyri, but by the gift and power of God. And this pattern isn't new. Long before Joseph Smith, thousands of years ago, the high priests of Israel used the Urim and Thummim to receive direct answers from God. Aaron wore the breastplate of judgment to inquire, of the Lord on Israel's behalf. And later traditions and commentaries, they expanded it, saying that the stones would glow or sometimes even form letters of light to spell out divine messages. And some legends even claim that when Moses sought God's counsel in the wilderness, that he actually saw the words that God would speak glowing on the folds of the tabernacle on the inside, when he was in the darkness of the inner sanctum. In other words, revelation through light emerging from darkness. It's the same pattern Joseph replicated, when he closed himself off from all the outside light to see the words of God appear. And it shows that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And he's still doing the same miracles now that he was doing then. Now here's the pivot I would say that most people miss. Even if Joseph directly translated, Egyptian isn't a single meaning one-for-one code. The same sign can be a sound or a picture or a category marker, or various other things depending on the context of the symbol. So if you assume that the papyrus is purely funerary, you get, things like embalmings and breathings and safe passage and stuff like that. But if you assume that what you're reading is actually a religious text or a temple text, the very same symbols describe things like cleansing, naming and presentation and enthronement, the ritual ascent into the divine presence. So a different lens definitely leads to a different reading. Joseph's explanations of the facsimiles land in that temple lens. That's why they sound like ordinances and priestly titles, governance of the heavens, new names, presentation before God. In fact, if you follow me on X, at Jonathan A. Plumb, anytime there's a new major update to, the big AIs out there like ChatGPT or Grok, one of the things I like to do is run each symbol from the facsimiles through and ask the AI to interpret the symbols in a religious or a sacred context instead of a funerary context. And each time I've had AI provide interpretations that very closely resemble translations that Joseph Smith provided. It's actually pretty remarkable what we can do with AI, and I wish more people understood the power of it, especially when it comes to research and study of scriptures and sacred texts. But if you read the whole or all the facsimiles that way, through a temple lens, the Book of Abraham really starts looking more like a membership record or a temple record. Now, critics can never really come up with anything new, right? We hear the same objections generation after generation. So I thought it would be good to maybe address some of the things that critics bring up. First, one is that they say that the surviving fragments we have don't actually say Abraham anywhere. And that is true. At least it's true about the fragments we have. But I think what's more likely is that Abraham was known by a different name when he was in Egypt. It's why there's no mention of Abraham, not just in the Book of Abraham or the papyri, but in any ancient Egyptian texts, not one, despite the Bible clearly recording that he went there. So you would think that we would find something that says Abraham, but we don't. And this is actually aligned with historical precedent. For example, when the Jews were carried off into Babylon, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were renamed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego by Nebuchadnezzar. Joseph himself, Joseph, the son of Jacob, received the name Zaphnath Paneah. I don't know how to say that, actually, but someone else probably does. Anyway, but, he had his changed name when he served Pharaoh. And, Queen Esther also was originally Hadassah. So, not only was it common for people to get new names in new places, but Joseph being renamed when he went into Egypt gives us a precedent pertaining specifically to Egypt. So that's, possibly why we don't find the name of Abraham actually in the text. And, in addition, I guess, ancient scribes routinely adapted names to, the local language, or pantheon or rank. So, it's really not surprising that we don't have Abraham spelled out in English for us in any of these. But it's a fair criticism, I guess, that his name doesn't show up. But, when you kind of understand the context of history, it at least gives you some room to, not let that criticism tank you at all. So another objection that's raised is that Joseph's explanations of the facsimiles are wrong. Now, of course, we already talked about the meaning of languages here, right? So if by wrong they mean that they don't match a 21st century funerary gloss, then fine. They weren't really meant to. Joseph read them as religious initiatory symbols, which is a real thing in Egyptian religion. Temple and funerary imagery overlap and often point to the same ascent theme. And once you allow that, Joseph's explanations are at least aimed at the right target. Covenant names, godly throne and cosmology, things like that. So yeah, I don't think that objection really has much weight behind it. Another objection tries to say that the Kirtland Egyptian papers prove Joseph matched, big paragraphs to single characters. And yes, we do have sheets with Egyptian characters written alongside English passages. That's definitely true. But here's, I think, what critics misunderstand. Spiritual translation isn't mechanical. God doesn't simply beam the correct words into an empty mind. Revelation works through the material already inside us. The Spirit draws upon what's in our memory and experience and assembles fragments of understanding until a clear image emerges. It's kind of like connecting the dots on a page. If you only have a few dots that are numbered, it's kind of hard to know what the image is supposed to be. But if prior research and study has properly placed the numbers, then it's easy for God to connect those dots. Scripture itself teaches us this. We are told to first study a matter out in our minds before taking it to the Lord to ask if it's right. And if it's right, the Lord can connect dots and harmonize that understanding for us so that we can see and know clearly what the truth is. But if we haven't studied first, then there are no dots for the Lord to connect, and so the Spirit can't do anything, and we receive nothing. So I don't agree that the idea, with the idea that these papers were just some after-the-fact language notes, like some apologetics claim. I think they were, in fact, preparatory work. Joseph and his scribes engaged the material so that revelation would have a foundation to be built upon. It's the same reason Moroni tutored Joseph for 4 full years before letting him get the gold plates. God required mental and spiritual readiness, and the study basically primes the vessel, so to speak, right? And then revelation fills it. So yeah, let's talk about. I think the last objection I'll probably talk about are anachronisms. So an anachronism is something that appears out of its proper time period, like a modern object or idea or word that shows up in an ancient setting. So in the Book of Abraham, critics claim that the use of Chaldeans or Pharaoh are anachronisms. But are they really, right? That's the question. First, I want to say here that our knowledge of the ancient world is incomplete. The ancient Near East keeps surprising us, and it could very well be that Chaldeans and Pharaoh were both known terms in Abraham's day. For instance, in the early 19th century, we didn't think Pharaoh was used before, about 1000 BC. But now we have proof that it was a royal title at least as early as 1400 BC. Same with Chaldeans. We first thought it wasn't found before 700 BC or so. But now we know that it goes at least as early as 1100 BC, maybe even earlier. One might argue that eventually we will find that these terms were in fact used and known to Abraham, and there are no anachronisms here at all. However, we do know that the papyri Joseph purchased, they were copies that were made post-Christ. So these weren't the original things written by Abraham. They were later copies. And the only other option we really have here is that those copies had names changed when the copies were made to reflect more modern understandings for their day. I don't really lean into this much, and I prefer to believe the text is true to its origin, and we simply haven't discovered yet that these words existed before we know them to have. But as a historian, I recognize we're constantly discovering that we knew things earlier and earlier than we previously thought. So, that's not an objection I would say closes the book at all. Let's move away from criticisms and bring up some aspects that support the idea of a true translation. So first is one called the Plain of Olishem. For over a century, that name was unknown outside of Joseph Smith's translation. But in the 1960s or 1970s, it might have been 1980s, somewhere in that frame, archaeologists were working with cuneiform tablets from ancient Mesopotamia, and they uncovered the name Ulisum. And it appears in inscriptions of the Akkadian king Naram Sin, which dates to around 2200 BC. It's the same general era that Abraham would have lived in. So those texts describe Naram Sin campaigning in the region of Haran and northern Syria, exactly the places that Genesis associates with Abraham's early life before he went into Canaan. Of course, scholars obviously reject the idea that Olishem and Ulisim are the same. They'll never say anything to even remotely admit that there might be evidence proving that Joseph Smith was a real prophet, right? But the correlation is definitely striking. You have a pretty rare, obscure name that shows up in Joseph's 1830 translation, and then more than a century after that, we discover this text that has a very, very similar word. And later evidence shows a real location with the same phonetic shape and in the right region and time frame. So, that's not a slam dunk, but it's the kind of historical resonance that suggests the Book of Abraham is describing a world that really existed. Another thing Joseph knew far ahead of his time was ritual slaying. For a long time, people said Egyptians didn't do human sacrifice. But now we know there are contexts in a handful of periods in Egyptian history where ritual killing or royal ritual violence was real, and which makes the attempted sacrifice of Abraham in the first chapter of Abraham culturally thinkable rather than impossible, especially for one who was preaching a religion contrary to the established Egyptian religion, right? The rulers probably wouldn't have looked too kindly on that, and it absolutely makes sense why they would have wanted to kill him. But why does any of this really matter? I think the real question critics are asking is theological. Can God reveal true ancient covenantal content through later copies and images? Right? Christianity itself answers yes. The New Testament authors read Israel's scriptures typologically, seeing Christ in symbols that earlier readers might have read differently. It wasn't until after Christ came that they looked back and said, oh yeah, that is kind of what these say, right? So it's the same principle. God can layer meaning. So, is the Book of Abraham fake? I'll leave that to you to decide, but I believe that it is real, it is true, and I do believe Joseph Smith translated it by the gift and power of God. So I hope that this helped you a little bit with kind of understanding what the Book of Abraham is, some objections, and some support for it. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to decide whether you believe it or not. So I want to thank you guys for watching. Been getting a little more engagement, which is pretty good. Getting more people giving me ideas of videos to make also. So definitely, if there's a topic that you're interested in, please drop it in the comments and I'll research it and I'll make a video. In fact, this video itself was from somebody asking me if I would look into the Book of Abraham for them. So I'm definitely listening to you guys, and I hope that I bring this information to you in an acceptable way. Always want to thank God for everything he does for helping me understand these things, and I look forward to whatever the next topic's going to be. See you guys later.